Bishop Noel Jones had shocked the entire gospel world when he finally revealed a secret he had carried for years, and you won't believe how deeply this truth shook everything people thought they knew about him. For decades, he stood as a giant of faith, a man whose voice moved crowds and whose presence made people believe he was unbreakable. But let me tell you, behind all the applause and bright lights, a quiet storm had lived inside him, one he hid even from the people closest to him. His confession came like an earthquake. He had gone through a divorce, not a rumor, not a misunderstanding, a real painful ending to a marriage everyone thought was blessed and perfect. And this is where it gets interesting because this wasn't just a simple breakup. It was a truth he never thought he would share, a truth that made people question if they ever truly knew the man behind the pulpit. He has spent years carrying the weight of being the flawless pastor, the man who guided millions while silently fighting his own battles. His rise in the gospel world had been extraordinary. Born into a family rooted deeply in faith, he grew up surrounded by spiritual expectations. From childhood, he displayed a fire, a charisma, a way of speaking that made people stop and listen. His sermons never felt like simple messages. They were moments that touched emotions people didn't even know they had. Crowds felt comforted by him, strengthened by him, and inspired by him. But as his influence grew, so did the pressure. He became not just a pastor, but an icon, someone people placed on a pedestal so high there was no room for him to be human. And what makes this story different? It was exactly this image of perfection that quietly began to trap him. While the world saw a strong spiritual leader, behind the scenes, he struggled with the reality of maintaining a marriage under a spotlight that never turned off. His marriage appeared perfect from the outside. People saw smiles, unity, and a couple dedicated to serving God together. But the truth was much more complicated. Behind closed doors, there were long nights where silence felt heavier than words. There were moments of distance that neither understood, pressures from ministry that followed them everywhere, and expectations that made even small disagreements feel enormous. But here is the shocking part. None of these cracks ever showed in public. He hid them with the same strength he used to guide the church, thinking that admitting weakness would disappoint the very people who looked up to him. Years passed, and the gap between his public life and private reality grew wider. He carried the guilt of trying to be everything for everyone, pastor, husband, leader, counselor, while slowly losing pieces of himself. He spent nights awake thinking about how he could fix things, how he could balance faith with family, how he could meet expectations that were slowly crushing him. And this is how the emotional pressure began to change him. He prayed, he tried, he pushed himself to keep going, but the weight never stopped growing. Friends close to him later said they saw moments where he looked tired, lost, and unsure, but he never spoke about it. He never wanted anyone to see the cracks forming in the man they believed was untouchable. The craziest part was that the breaking point didn't come from a big fight or a dramatic moment. It came quietly, in the small emotional wounds that kept getting deeper over time. He realized the marriage he was trying so hard to protect on the outside was slowly falling apart on the inside. And the day he finally accepted this reality, destiny took an unexpected turn. His heart broke before the world even knew anything was wrong. The decision to divorce wasn't made in anger. It was made in a heartbreak, exhaustion, and painful honesty. He felt like he had failed his partner, failed his congregation, failed the image people worshipped. And yet, he also felt something he hadn't felt in years: clarity. The truth was out. The weight of secrecy was gone. But the shockwave it would send through the world, that was still just beginning to unfold. After the truth of his divorce finally surfaced, the impact hit him harder than he had ever imagined. The world he had built, the world that saw him as unshakable, suddenly felt fragile. People whispered, questioned, and wondered how a man who preached about commitment could face something so painful in his own home. And you won't believe how deeply those silent judgments cut him. He had always carried the expectations of millions on his back, but now those expectations turned into doubts and criticism he wasn't prepared for. Yet, let me tell you, this was only the beginning of the emotional storm that followed him long after the divorce papers were signed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a leader. He felt like a man standing alone in the ruins of a life he tried so hard to protect. The nights became heavier. He spent hours sitting in silence, thinking about every choice he had made, every moment he wished he could rewrite. He questioned whether he had prayed enough, tried enough, loved enough, and this is where it gets interesting, because instead of finding comfort in the faith he taught others, he found himself wrestling with God in a way he had never experienced before. He asked why the marriage failed, why he couldn't make it work, and why he had carried the image of perfection so long that he forgot how to admit he needed help. The emotional weight didn't stop there. Church responsibilities continued. The congregation still expected him to preach with the same passion, the same fire, the same confidence. But behind the pulpit, he felt like a man wearing a mask that kept slipping with every passing day. But here's the shocking part. Even when he stood smiling before the crowd, he felt more alone than ever. He felt the distance between him and the people who trusted him, not because they changed, but because he finally realized how much of himself he had hidden from them. The man they admired wasn't the whole truth, just the part he allowed them to see. Meanwhile, memories from the marriage followed him everywhere he went. He remembered the early days filled with hope, the quiet moments they shared before the weight of ministry took over, the times they laughed without thinking about the future. But he also remembered the arguments that ended in silence, the misunderstandings that never healed, and the questions they both avoided because neither wanted to break the image they had built. Every memory felt like a reminder of what he had lost and what he had failed to protect. And this is how guilt slowly became a shadow he couldn't escape. He blamed himself for not being present enough, for letting ministry consume him, for pretending everything was fine when nothing truly was. Then came the craziest part, something he never expected. People closest to him started noticing changes. His voice trembled slightly during sermons. His eyes carried a sadness he couldn't hide. His energy felt different, quieter, almost wounded. For the first time, he didn't try to deny it. He didn't try to pretend. He allowed himself to be human. And the moment he let that vulnerability slip out, something unexpected happened. People began to connect with him in a way they never had before. They saw not a perfect leader, but a man hurting, a man trying to rebuild, a man who had survived a storm he never talked about. Destiny took an unexpected turn when he realized that maybe this pain had a purpose. Maybe this breaking wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a truth he had been too afraid to live. He started opening up to those he trusted, speaking honestly about his struggles, admitting the weaknesses he had always hidden. And the more he talked, the more he understood how much pressure he had carried alone. He began to see that the downfall didn't happen overnight. It had grown quietly, just like the cracks he never addressed. But this was only the emotional beginning. What happened next, the reactions, the backlash, the self-discovery, those moments changed everything about who he was, how he preached, and what he believed about himself. After facing the raw reality of his divorce, Bishop Noel Jones entered a period of deep reflection. Every day felt like a battle between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. Let me tell you, it was a time filled with questions he had never asked himself before. Could he continue to lead his congregation while carrying so much personal pain? Could he reconcile the image of a devoted pastor with the truth of a broken marriage? This is where it gets interesting because the answers weren't simple, and each choice he made seemed to carry more weight than any sermon he had ever preached. He began to examine his past, replaying moments from his marriage with clarity he hadn't had before. He remembered the small things, the quiet arguments over trivial matters, the long nights apart due to ministry obligations, the times he chose work over emotional presence. And you won't believe how many of these tiny, unnoticed moments had added up over years, slowly pushing them apart. He realized that love alone wasn't always enough when combined with the immense pressures of public expectation. The man who had once felt invincible now understood that even faith and dedication could not prevent human struggles. Friends and close advisors tried to help him navigate this storm. They suggested counseling, reflection, and patience, but the internal battle was his alone. Nights were spent in deep prayer, wrestling not only with guilt, but with the fear of public judgment. He worried about losing respect, about disappointing those who looked up to him as a model of faith. But here is the shocking part. The more he feared judgment, the more he discovered that hiding the truth had already cost him his peace. His silence had protected an image, but it had trapped him emotionally, spiritually, and even physically. The realization hit him like lightning. Authenticity was not a weakness, it was a necessity. During this time, he also discovered unexpected lessons about leadership and connection. By allowing himself to be vulnerable, he began to reach people in ways he never had before. He shared small stories of personal struggle, of doubt, of mistakes made in love and ministry. The congregation, once expecting only perfection, responded with empathy and support. This is how his transparency became a form of guidance, showing others that even spiritual leaders face storms and that courage is found in honesty. The irony was undeniable. The divorce he had feared would destroy his image had instead given him a depth of connection he had never experienced. And then came the craziest part. He realized that the divorce had reshaped not only his personal life, but his entire approach to ministry. He started speaking more from experience than from doctrine alone, offering wisdom not just from scripture, but from life lived with struggle, doubt, and pain. He began to teach that failure was not the opposite of faith, but a part of it. That even when life takes unexpected turns, hope, resilience, and purpose can be found. Destiny took an unexpected turn again, because the man who had once been seen as untouchable now felt more human and, paradoxically, more powerful in his influence than ever before. Yet even as he rebuilt himself, the shadow of public scrutiny lingered. Questions about his personal choices, the divorce, and his morality still followed him. Some critics doubted his ability to continue leading. Some wondered if his spiritual authority was compromised. And what makes this story different? He faced these doubts not by hiding, but by confronting them openly, speaking honestly about his fears, regrets, and the lessons he had learned. Every confession, every admission of vulnerability slowly transformed public perception, from judgment to admiration, from disbelief to understanding. As time passed, Bishop Noel Jones began to embrace a life that was both humbler and stronger than ever before. He realized that the divorce, as painful as it had been, was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a deeper, more authentic journey. Let me tell you, this period taught him lessons that no amount of success or praise could ever provide. He started living in a way that allowed him to be fully honest about his struggles, his mistakes, and even his fears. This is where it gets interesting, because in choosing transparency, he found a freedom that had eluded him for decades. He spoke openly about the loneliness he had felt, the guilt that weighed on him, and the constant pressure of being seen as perfect. But he also shared moments of growth, moments when he realized that the very imperfections he had tried to hide were the bridge that connected him to others. Congregants, once surprised by the revelation of his divorce, began to see a leader who was human, relatable, and courageous. You won't believe how powerful that connection became as people found hope in his honesty and strength in his resilience. His faith, once measured by flawless appearances, was now measured by authenticity and the ability to persevere despite hardship. What made his story different from others was the way he turned personal heartbreak into a tool for teaching and inspiration. He emphasized that even leaders of faith are human, that mistakes do not define worth, and that vulnerability can be a source of strength. He began sharing insights about love, relationships, and emotional health, using his experiences to guide people through struggles they had long hidden themselves. But here is the shocking part. By revealing his struggles, he actually strengthened his ministry rather than weakened it, transforming his story of loss into one of redemption and empowerment. The craziest part of all was how this transformation affected his personal relationships. Bishop Jones discovered new ways to connect with family, friends, and followers, not through perfection, but through presence, honesty, and empathy. He realized that being authentic and acknowledging human flaws allowed him to form deeper, more meaningful bonds. Destiny took an unexpected turn because the very thing he had feared, exposing his vulnerabilities, became his greatest gift. Through the divorce and the journey that followed, he rebuilt not only his personal life, but also his spiritual legacy, proving that faith and humanity can coexist in even the most challenging circumstances. By the end of this journey, Bishop Noel Jones's story was no longer just about a divorce. It became a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of truth. He showed the world that even the strongest figures face storms, but those storms can teach, transform, and inspire. This is how a man who was once seen as untouchable became relatable, loved, and respected in an entirely new way. And as his story spread, it left everyone reflecting not only on his life, but on the expectations we place on leaders, the strength it takes to be human, and the unexpected ways life can teach us to rise stronger than before. The story of Bishop Noel Jones didn't end with heartbreak. It ended with a lesson that continues to touch hearts and challenge minds everywhere. You won't believe how one confession changed everything, proving that even in loss, there can be growth, healing, and a renewed purpose that goes beyond anything imagined.